Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the complete competitive EX05 meta environment. So I know this wasn't a very long format, and I also know that there wasn't a whole lot of events in the format as a result, but we do have some data to talk about and look over when it comes to what exactly happened in EX5 for the English version of the game. The first thing that I always like to do before getting into the nitty-gritty of how it performed in English is, well, take a look at what the set did in Japan. I know Japanese data isn't the most perfect considering just the style changes in how they're collecting their data versus how we're collecting our data, but regardless, this does give us a frame of reference in terms of, well, what actually was going on over there and what was the mindset that players were having. So Anubismon was the best deck in the Japanese format as well as the English format, and then everything else seemed like it was business as usual in terms of, well, just other decks being represented in the meta. A lot of them are reoccurring decks, considering EX sets aren't necessarily known for power spiking the game, usually, but it does seem like it's still a pretty healthy spread, considering BT14 was a fairly healthy environment. So what does the meta look like now? Well, the top deck is Anubismon, and it's no coincidence that it was the best deck in Japan, so it's going to be the best deck here, and it's the best by actually quite a large margin. If time were to progress, Anubismon's overall representation would most likely only increase, especially with no bans or limits. We already know that he is getting limited, so it's not like we would see any noticeable decrease until that took into effect. There was a total of 2 events this format. One was the North American Nationals, which has the most data that we had to pull from because they gave us a top 64 breakdown, and then we also had the Oceania or Australian event, which was a little bit smaller and we don't have as much data for, and they only gave us top 16. But based on the 2 events, Anubismon is very clearly damaging and limiting the format, warping it around him, and it doesn't necessarily seem like he actually has any natural hard counters keeping him in check, and everything else that was able to top seemed to kind of just get lucky. Purple seems to be a very clearly dominating color in this format as a whole. So as far as the actual data for the events, well, here is the EX5 North American Nationals top 64. So we had Anubismon very clearly at the top at 25 different Anubismon decks, making up 39% of the meta out of what was able to top in top 64. Then we had Mirage and Red Hybrids as the only other 2 decks that had good enough representation to kind of be their own tier, and the rest kind of just seemed to, again, feel like it just got lucky enough to be able to either play around Anubismon or dodge Anubismon in terms of its matchups. So it's still a pretty decent spread of decks. But if we didn't have Anubismon choking at the top, I'm pretty sure that the format would be a lot healthier. So if we look at both top 16s, we could see that Anubismon did end up winning both events. There was still a pretty decent spread of different decks between a lot of different aggro decks and a lot of different control decks. Most of the aggro just seemed to go towards Red Hybrids in terms of what was able to be successful, or just be able to have the OTK potential to try to remove as much security as possible, and then the only other thing that was kind of being played was just, well, security and defensive decks to try to slow down and control what Anubismon was mostly trying to do, and it's not like the counters to Anubismon weren't hurting various other decks as well. So as far as just another image in terms of the numbers of decks that were hitting top 16s in the TAC Oceania event, then when it comes to the PPG North American finals, again, Anubismon was the winner for both of them. So as far as what are the top 5 decks of EX5 meta, well, it's going to be Anubismon as the best deck, followed by Red Hybrids, Mirage, Gaugamon, Metal Garurumon X, and Security Control, all just below Anubismon. So when it comes to looking at the meta, it's always good to know what some important tech cards are in order to, well, help your deck be able to fight against the incoming meta. So as far as the most important tech cards that I found after looking at a decent number of lists, well, we could kind of just limit it to a couple of cards. So it seems like purple decks wanted to try to adopt a Black Gatomon Uver just because, well, it's a dark animal, so it could fit into a lot of different decks. It's a security Digimon, so it actually matters when it comes out of security, and it actually has an on-play ability that's doing something that, well, most other cards in the entire game aren't doing, and that's trash-based interactions. So because purple is such a strong color, actually having a card to interact with the opponent's trash to try to put them off of their game plan seemed to be a very relevant piece of tech. Then when it comes to just some other really good tech cards, making sure that your deck has really good wide board removal is going to be very valuable. Anubismon isn't the only deck in the meta that was a go wide deck, and it seems like a lot of the other go wide decks, because Anubismon was the best, just seemed to get hurt incidentally, just because, well, everyone's teching for Anubismon, and you just so happen to fall into the same type of weaknesses that Anubismon does, so it seemed like teching towards Anubismon really hurt every other go-wide deck. Then it seemed like the last piece of tech card that is always going to be relevant is going to be, well, the different floodgates that we have to try to anti-tempo the opponent. In this format specifically, it seemed like the best ones were the ones that allows the opponent to not be able to gain memory by card effects, reduce the play cost of the cards that they're playing, and play Digimon by effects entirely. One thing I kind of observed over the past couple of years playing Digimon is Nationals always seems to be the worst format of the entire year. If it's not the worst, it's definitely one of the worst. That's kind of just a really interesting observation, because in year one, we had EX1 just come out, and, well, with EX1, BT6 was the last relevant meta, and, well, Gabuband took up the majority of the top slots in that environment, and in that environment, we had 4 Ice Walls legal, which now is limited to 1. Then in year 2, we had BT11 come out as the premier set, and that changed the meta to be more Black War Greymon dominance. So Black War Greymon X was just the best deck. It did have one natural counter to it, which was Grandis, which was the only deck that had any other decent competitive success in terms of the numbers supporting it. Then with that, we also had 4 BT11 Greymon X antibody, which was legal back then and now is limited to 1. Then in year 3, which is this year, EX05 just came out, so each one of these years we had a new set came out like literally a couple of weeks before, which didn't necessarily give players a whole lot of time to be able to build, develop, and test their decks. But regardless, EX5 just came out, and Anubismon was the king of that meta, and with EX5, we already know that EX5 Anubismon, EX5 Gabumon X, and EX5 Garurumon X are going to be limited to 1. Usually, they wait for post-nationals to make their ban announcement changes, but we got this one a little bit preemptively to try to stave off some of the players' worries. And then looking at just how things have been progressing with the game, there are a couple of things that I kind of feel like needs to be addressed when it comes to things that are impacting the game as a whole. So right now there are some very clear problems with the game, and I feel like what is being made and designed, if they continue, will only ruin the overall experience compared to what players want. So without going too in-depth on the actual problems with the game, the 3 things that I want to highlight really quickly is going to be the fact that the delay options, we actually need a way to be able to interact with them while they're on the field. The second thing is, well, the trash. We just need more ways to be able to interact with the trash in order to try to counteract trash-based strategies, which right now we have borderline almost 0 counterplay for. And then the last thing does come from from how they're just designing cards in general. Bandai needs to stop making cards that are undermining the systems and mechanics of the game, and they need to stop making cards that are cheating on tempo, allowing you to gain momentum for utilizing resources that generally should have an associated cost to them. Once they fix these things, I think the game is going to be in a much better spot overall. In conclusion, EX5 meta is not necessarily the healthiest. It might seem like it looks healthy, but considering basically any deck that isn't Anubismon, Mirage, or Red Hybrids basically kind of just got lucky in terms of them actually being represented in the top slots. Anubis is very clearly the best deck in the format by a very wide margin, and in the past, we didn't necessarily have as high of a percentage in terms of how the top deck was well topping, and that's partially due because Anubis actually doesn't really have any bad matchups, and it doesn't really have any definitive counters or counterplay to it. Purple has become a very clear and problematic color due to all the acceleration that it got in such a short period of time, being able to fill up its trash super easily, and because the trash doesn't have actually any interaction with it, or very minimal, the fact that once their trash is set up, it basically just goes from there, and what made Anubis so strong is the fact that he just sets himself up while he's digivolving, where a lot of other purple decks need some setup before they start digivolving, really separated Anubismon compared to every other purple deck in the entire game, and it's kind of just unfair how much extra resources that purple has as a result of being able to utilize its trash, especially with minimal setup. So in my opinion, the game has reached a speed point that makes the format feel borderline toxic and unfun. After playing in Nationals, I really didn't want to go back and play more EX5, which I felt like was a huge problem for somebody who really loves the game. And even though we do know cards are getting limited, that didn't really fix the issue that we had with EX5. And I think that if we had a ban and restriction impact EX5 for our Nationals format, it would have made the game more enjoyable overall, at least in my opinion.